Vale. Hola, buen día.
Good morning. Welcome to this last session, but one of this wonderful time use week. This session is about time use in Catalan research. It's a bit poetic, but we're not going to be talking about literature. We're going to be talking about science. My name is Manolis Cojavinas. I'm at the Global Health Institute in Barcelona, and we study circadian rhythms and cancer, and also in relation to work and daytime, exposure to light, time in relation to meals, meal times, all sorts of things that have been addressed one way or another throughout the week. We have an exceptional panel of researchers here, researchers working in Catalonia. Joan Garcia, Sara Moreno, Nuria Codina, Santiago Estaún, and Adriano Targa. I will introduce them in turn. Interestingly, this panel is a bit of a reflection, a mirror of what this week has been. It's been a very multidisciplinary week. We've been talking about economics, about chronotypes, about molecules, about sociology. Here we have a demographer, a sociologist, two psychologists, and one neuroscientist and pharmacologist. This is wonderful. We will be hearing about different research perspectives on time. And of course, other important specialties are missing here. We don't have anybody studying the effects of light. We have very good physicists of light, and of course, light is crucial to the time factor. When our 5 panelists sent in their self-descriptions, none described him or herself as a chronobiologist, even though what they do is definitely falls within the sphere of chronobiology. But in any case, an hour and a half doesn't provide for covering everything. We're going to hear from each one in turn for 10 minutes each, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Please send in your comments or questions using the chat function, and then we'll have the general debate at the end. We're going to start with Joan Garcia, who's a demographer at the Center for Demographic Studies, Centro de Estudios Demográficos. So go ahead, Joan, and you can introduce yourself in a couple of words if you like. Thanks, everybody, for taking part in this. Good morning. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this Time Use Week. As the moderator has said, my name is Joan Garcia, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Demographic Studies. I will be discussing time use variations during the course of life. I think my presentation is up by now. So, I am a researcher at the Center for Demographic Studies. This is the work of my small research group. My Gajenjo and myself work together. This is a sample of some of our research of the past few years. We work with quantitative data. We work with people using time use diaries. We first look at double income couples, then we looked at time uses in relation to children. Marc has also worked with Sara Moreno, who is another panelist today. Today, I'll be describing one piece of research which is highly quantitative, as I described earlier. So what I'll be reporting on is a real survey of time use in Spain, and it examines time allocated to different activities by men and women. You will see a whole list of activities on the slide, but we focused especially on paid work, housework, and leisure. So we will analyze the time spent on each type of activity. Then we will zero in on housework and leisure. And finally, we will look specifically at the employed population and compare their weekdays and weekends. And we'll also look at what's happening at different periods in life. According to your classic life course, you can see these different categories based on age, but also partnered status and child or childless status. Some of the periods in life are not included here, but the great majority are. And this is a kind of chart we'll be showing. They're all the same. The blue line is for men. The orange line is for women. And what we're displaying is mean daily time spent on each type of activity. The red bars tell us about significant differences with a 99% confidence interval. The main differences are seen in paid work, housework, care for others, and leisure. And here we can see the same activities that are more enlarged. Okay, what do we find? Early in life, children don't spend a lot of time on paid work. But then if you look at young adults living on their own, there aren't huge differences between men and women. The differences begin to arise when couples move together, and especially when they have children. Housework. Women spend more time on that at all stages in life. And the differences even begin at a very early age between boys and girls. Even though young children spend little time on housework, 10 to 17-year-olds living with their parents find that girls are devoting some 20 minutes more to housework a week than boys. But this becomes increased when people have children. In the case of men, the time devoted to housework becomes a flat line. If you notice that the blue line is flat or nearly flat beyond a certain age. In the case of women, in fact, the curve really climbs with the arrival of children. Something similar occurs in care for others, which is mostly care for children, because care for adults is not often reflected in these surveys. So what we find is that the more children there are, the more time women are spending on care for others, whereas the male curve is a lot flatter, no matter the number of children. Moving on to leisure. At every one of these stages, men devote more time to leisure. The only time when the difference is significant is when with childless couples. So after childless couples, that's when the lines cross. One assumes that when they cross, it's because they're spending time together. But in any case, the difference is about half an hour to 1 hour at every stage in life, and the differences increase for elderly couples over 60. Now here we can see different types of housework. Routine, occasional, like repairs, for instance, and then sort of management. Now, routine tasks are significantly handled mostly by women. Women devote much more time to routine tasks. Occasional tasks, it's women who spend more time on those. Overall, of course. Another thing about this curve that we can see is the flatness of the routine housework curve for men and the climb in the case of women when children arrive. It can reach up to 2.5 hours, the difference, and if there are more than 2 children, up to 3 hours. If it's a matter of management, the gap is smaller, but it's still women who spend more time. Turning to leisure now. Significant differences are found in sports. Men spend more time on sports, especially at more advanced ages. This perhaps includes some less intensive activities, such as going for a stroll, which might entail more time. Hobbies. Men spend more time on hobbies, especially during the early childcare periods. You can see, well, actually, during childhood, you can see a huge difference between boys and girls. And then there's also a lot more time, especially devoted to watching TV at later ages. And there aren't significant differences in terms of social time, culture, or passive leisure. We thought we would see a difference in terms of cultural activities, but that's not what we've found. Finally, looking exclusively at the employed population, we compared time during weekdays and weekends. The differences are found particularly on weekdays. Let me focus especially on housework. The gap is huge, much bigger between men and women in terms of housework on weekdays. This illustrates the difference between weekday housework, which is usually something that has to be done at that time, and weekend housework, which is usually housework that can be postponed more easily. And also you can see the flatness of the male curve and how there's a climb in the female curve with children, with the arrival of children. And for leisure, there isn't a big difference. So to sum it all up, time use changes over life, and it's different between men and women. Differences appear at very early ages, and the major differences are found in the case of housework. We also find that it is the presence of children that increases the gender gap, especially for housework. And our conclusions as regards the employed population is that the differences are bigger during weekdays. And well, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Joan. That's a really good introduction to uses of time through life. We'll save the question till the end, but you can send in your questions now using the chat function. I think that was an excellent introduction for Sara's presentation. Sara Moreno is a sociologist at the Department of Sociology of the Autonomous University of Barcelona, UAB. She'll be talking about time and work, a controversial gender perspective. Joan has addressed the gender perspective, but in fact, Sara will be addressing it in greater depth. So without further ado, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'd like to, of course, express my gratitude for the possibility of joining in this panel discussion. I'm a researcher at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I'm part of the QUIT group, which does research on daily life and work. And our work on time uses, or my work on time uses, is work that I do together with Vicent Borràs. As you pointed out, Manolis, My 10 minutes, my 10-minute presentation is very much a kind of partner and counterpart to Joan's presentation. I'm going to be telling you about this line of research we've been conducting for years, which is a sociological analysis of changes in time uses with a gender perspective. Joan already introduced the topic with more of a focus on life stages. In my case, I will be particularly examining changes over time in time uses, but I have three underlying factors that condition my perspective. First of all, gender perspective. Time uses really bring into relief differences between men and women, and also illustrate the fact that the mere male-female gender difference is not enough. We have to factor in age, occupation, employment, level of education, and other factors. Second theoretical premise. Our assumption is that time allocated to paid work and time allocated to housework and care for others are intertwined. More time allocated to paid work means less time allocated to care work, and vice versa. And thirdly, another starting point is that time is multidimensional. One dimension of time is quantitative. It's about what people do and how they break down their use of the 24 hours available in each day. But aside from that, we believe that it's just as important to know what meaning people give to what they're doing with their time. And that's why our sociological perspective combines both a quantitative and a qualitative approach. And that's a bit controversial. Usually when you do qualitative research, you end up bringing on board certain factors that you can't see in the quantitative research. Sometimes there's actually a contradiction between the figures and the qualitative research. That said, I would now like to describe the trends we've found in recent studies. If we focus on changes and discontinuities in time use, there are two starting research questions are clear. If we look at all of the research over the past couple of decades, we can clearly see that there is a general trend for time use to converge between the genders. In other words, the gender gap is very gradually being closed, that gender gap that Joan described so well. One of our permanent aims is to assess how this convergence is actually occurring in our context. And to the extent that the convergence is taking place, whether it's actually changing patterns of life. So based not only on this research by Joan, but also the earlier survey carried out in 2002, 2003, and comparing that to 2009, 2010, what we can see is this trend that I mentioned. It is very gradual, as I said, but yes, there is a trend for a reduction of the gender gap. Especially if we look at housework and care for others, there are two differences that are highlighting a certain degree of convergence. First of all, there is some reduction in the gap between the time allocated by men and women to housework. If you compare 2002, 2003, and 2009, 2010, the two surveys, the two different time periods, you can see that the difference is lower in the second wave of surveys. Interestingly, This is not the result of a substitution effect. It's not women working less and men working more at housework and care for others. It's because women are allocating less time to it. Men continue to allocate as much time as they used to, with no increase. So the gender gap is reduced, but simply because women are doing less work, less care work, especially cleaning and cooking. And of course, cleaning and cooking have a rigid and daily nature that means that they have a very different kind of impact, as Joanne pointed out. So that's one trend, convergence, but in this particular way. And then there's another trend, which is convergence in terms of care for children. It's very hard in these surveys to really gauge what's going on with the care of dependent adults. But in the case of care of children, the difference that has taken place between 2002 and 2009 is that both men and women are devoting more time to caring for children. So there is a convergence. Men are spending more time on that, but women are also spending more time than they were. So that's what the general data are telling us overall. Now, if we start looking at other variables that can help explain which groups experience the most change, if we look at the women spending less time on housework, age is a huge factor. Younger women are spending less time on housework, particularly college-educated women. So there's a generational variable here too, which also interplays with the life cycle analysis that Joanne did. We're also interested in how people allocate their time through the day, but as I said earlier, what meaning they attribute to this kind of work. So we tried to research this. We wanted to assess whether changes in time uses had some kind of impact on daily habits. And so our qualitative research consists of in-depth surveys, in-depth interviews, rather, to assess what the people's perception is of their daily life. And by combining our surveys and these interviews, we can see other things emerge. So there are two ideas I'd like to bring out here. In terms of the time devoted to housework by younger women, adult women, what we can see through interviews is that there are different value attributions to cleanliness, sort of household standards or housework standards, perhaps, in terms of care for, cleaning, but also care of clothes. So younger women just value cleanliness less and devote less time to cleaning. And that's clearly a difference between younger generations and older generations for whom daily cleaning is a routine. If you think of your typical picture of your older woman who sweeps the sidewalk every day, well, that's a routine, and it shows certain values, and these are values that are not present amongst the younger. The same goes for cooking. A lot of time is devoted to eating, but not to cooking, and that, of course, also ties in with a lot of purchasing of pre-cooked food, or so, which what we are calling a kind of masculinization of domestic work. So where the way we value cooking and housework is resembling more and more the way men used to value it. So basically what we find is that there is more dust and less cooking in the home, to put it succinctly and in oversimplification. Another thing that we find is that with middle to high income, double income couples, the increase in time spent with children by both genders is actually not a matter of how much time is allocated to work, because these are double income couples. So when we ask people about what significance they attribute to care for children, in the interviews we find that part of the couple's goals really, or the couple's goals as a couple, really assign a lot of importance to children. So we have fewer children than ever, but we're devoting more time to them than we ever did. The value of children is beyond its proper dimension in the society. In fact, care of children is gaining in centrality compared to work time. In fact, a lot of activities, including work, get reorganized as a function of children's activities and leisure or time spent with children. For women, this is about a real explosion in the values of motherhood. Especially when you have few children, you really value the time spent with them. And in the case of fathers, we talk about intensive fathering. Fathers were either absent fathers or hover satellite fathers who might be there or not, perhaps according to whether it was a weekend or a weekday, or whether specific tasks needed to be carried out. But with younger parents, we find fathers who do much more intensive fathering, which is what would explain why they're spending more time caring for children. I have one more thing I want to say before I conclude, and I'm happy to answer questions about these two trends, feminization of care time in terms of attributed values and so forth, but masculinization in terms of the value of the housework. Thank you very much, Sara. How very interesting. Later on, we will be discussing whether the changes you've just described are the result of particular policies or how they have taken place. It's also important in terms of deciding what to do into the future. One point that you mentioned, but only in passing, was leisure. Leisure is Núria Codina's topic. Núria Codina is a professor at the University of Barcelona, and she's also a researcher at the research group on social, environmental, and organizational psychology, and she will be talking about leisure. Thank you for coming here, Núria.
Thank you for inviting us to this Time Use Week, which I believe to be a turning point in terms of being aware of how significant time is in our lives, as it plays a vital role amongst ourselves and in our societies, especially now. Now, I'm part of a research group in social psychology, environmental, and organizational psychology. And within that group, there's a subgroup which we call Time Plus. Let me just share my screen with you. Give me 1 second. I hope it works. Can you see my screen? You cannot see it? Okay, so that was what I meant. I wanted to share my screen during this presentation. We can see it now. I can see it. Okay, great. Let me continue. My apologies for this little hiccup. So, as I said, I'm part and I'm leading this Time Plus subgroup, and by that we mean more than time. and also positive time. We work with a general goal in mind, which is that people should be skillful at managing their own time. What do we mean that people should be able or skillful at managing their own time? Well, that means that we should all be aware of developing ourselves in all of our potentialities and all the different diverse activities, but also in building our identity. We focus on identity quite a lot. So our research aims to offer guidelines to better manage both the quantitative time, that is, that people can organize themselves and structure the time according to their needs and wishes, but also, by the same token, people should be able to manage their own time to promote their own well-being, development, and how they use their time in general, socially. For instance, and the right quantitative organization of time means allocating the necessary time to each task or to coordinate more complex tasks and to combine them with more simple tasks. So the right qualitative management of time would be different. That would mean to occupy oneself with activities that contribute some kind of well-being. If we've been working a whole day in front of a computer, isolated from others, as part of our leisure time, obviously we should be prioritizing other kind of relational activities. I already mentioned that it is a research group, but I'm going to present some results, and I'll do my best to transform the raw data into statements that can offer some best practices that can be promoted at schools, after-school activities, social educators, sports coaches, or any other person working in this field. Let me begin by sharing some cross-cutting results, and they show some of the things that we've noticed as part of these research studies. I'll start by saying that leisure, when it's successful, it revitalizes, it facilitates identity building, and that happens at any age. We must stress that leisure is an activity based on identity. It builds identity, especially during your teenage years, which has been thoroughly documented. We can see that young people have their first experiences of individuation in their family environment, and they do that through leisure. However, leisure also plays a role in other dynamics, identity building amongst the grown-ups, amongst the adults at different ages. Leisure is an activity or a realm where our identity is enriched because we have more freedom. We can choose what we do, who we want to be surrounded by, and we can explore our own interests. So what the data are telling us is that leisure can be a very significant factor both in the development of the person, but also in a different process, which is how to integrate immigrants into society, to help women that have been abused, to help people who have been addicted to substances, or people who go through a very significant change in their lives, such as going through a divorce, retirement, or when somebody loses a partner that they've been living with for many years. Now, in different research scenarios, we've observed that leisure is one of the best possible scenarios for self-expression. Throughout history, this has been noticed again in different societies. Leisure has been the place where people have expressed what they value the most. What happened with our current society? what is it that we found as part of our study from a psychosocial point of view? We realized that leisure is indeed this field for self-expression. It is a tool that feeds our identity. It helps build an identity. It provides a great satisfaction to devote regular time with this rigorous dedication where people can express their abilities, their skills, or their sensitivities. Let me phrase this in a more specific fashion. This self-expression is to be seen in activities that take place, let's say, seriously. And by that we mean going to the theater, listening to music, spending time gardening, or collecting objects. So in this case as well, according to the data, leisure not only facilitates self-expression, but it is also a key element in the integration process I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to focus on some general aspects that are cross-cutting in nature and that we have observed as well in some of our studies. Let me give you some more specific examples of leisure and what it contributes to the person's identity. First, we can speak about physical activity or exercise, sports, as leisure. We can see that it bolsters obviously physical health, but also mental health. And there's one specific characteristic of this kind of leisure, even though it is shared by other kinds of leisure, obviously, and it overlaps with some of the things that my colleagues mentioned. Sports and physical activity contributes resilience, in the case of women mostly, especially women who have never practiced sports before. Now, specifically, we found that this kind of practice is a possibility for women to rediscover themselves in terms of their economy, their personal skills, and also the possibility to enjoy a social life. In the case of working women, we also realize that this activity helps them discover the need they have to enjoy a place of their own, a place that doesn't have to do with cleaning, as we said, or taking care of their families. So just a place of their own. And this is what they value the most, to enjoy this personal space for them and a place where they can meet and to enjoy sports. Yet there's another very significant aspect about sports and physical activity amongst women, which is how to maintain this in time. The data show that amongst women, the factor that helps them keep this activity constant is how they relate to other peers, to other people with whom they can share some characteristic, with whom they have a commonality. So there must be some kind of connections from an identity point of view. So this renders women more capable of keeping this kind of physical activity during time, rather than the support of their family members or a medical prescription. So let us move to a different kind of activity now, another leisure activity, which is sometimes seen as skeptical or ambivalent. Video games. Okay, I'm being told that I need to rush through this. So what is it we found? Usually people play video games because of the satisfaction that they contribute, as well as the identity that is built around them. So we realize how important it is to work on the design of video games and to foster values that society can consider dear. Now, let me finish by saying that there are many activities that we develop on a regular basis. So, very briefly, we realized that when you practice your leisure on a regular basis, it helps you avoid procrastination, a term that we rarely use. However, we practice it many times. Procrastinate, just to put things off for tomorrow, things that should have been done today, etc. This not only poses problems in managing time, there were tasks that could have been done the right way today. It also has psychological consequences. It creates anxiety, depression, so low self-esteem, etc. So this is a therapeutic effect, we could call it. So regular leisure is a good practice to follow. Let me finish by saying that I underscored self-expression, video games, and regular leisure or physical activity because they help build an identity. I could have spoken about other factors, such as, for instance, the significance of educational styles in leisure and in time management, or the differences in terms of time availability between the genders, even though my colleagues already mentioned this before, but from a more qualitative perspective and how time is valued, the little time that women enjoy is valued by them. I think this was a nice summary of our research activity. We focus on leisure because we believe it is one more aspect pertaining to time management and how it links to identity building, because obviously it's an essential element of human behavior. That's it for me. I didn't get to mention any specific project that we undertook, but obviously you can access these two links on leisure. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Nuria. That was an interesting presentation. I have to say that these presentations are available. After the session, they can access the links that you were talking about, and then you can read about Nuria's group's work. While we're speaking about research, we are probably dealing with the same kind of issues from different standpoints. This happens all the time. You were speaking about video games. My group studies video games because of how screens impact us. So I'm analyzing biological things, so how this impacts sleep patterns amongst children, and also its effect of neurodevelopment. So it's how interesting how we're all contributing our own vision about the same phenomenon, right? In this case, time use. Thank you. We'll now move to the fourth presentation of this session of Professor Santiago Estaún, who is an emeritus professor of psychology at the UAB. And he's going to talk to us about one of these prevailing topics, which is school time and how schooling time can be managed. It's an extremely important topic. Thank you, Santiago. Thank you for having invited me to participate. Now that I'm retired and I'm no longer part of the active research groups, I was particularly happy, but at the same time, I had my qualms because I didn't know exactly what I could contribute, given that I have a historic knowledge rather than more current, more up to date, even though obviously I'm concerned about these topics that have been rekindled because some colleagues from Valencia asked me to resume work again, and how this whole thing has had an impact on us. Well, I believe that time has always been a key factor. From the very beginning for me, I started working in psychology with an idea about time, what time was, what time behaved, and how children understood the notion of time. And that was based on how children were able, when I was also a child, or when I was young as well, to tell about a movie they had seen or a story that had been shown with images, and something that lasted an hour and a half, that involved years and years of work. So I've always approached time from a conceptual point of view. from a cognitive conceptual point of view, how time is experienced and conceptualized. If you could please show my slides somehow with the arrow of time, as people call it, we'll be able to move through them and see some of the issues that I wrote down. Next, please. I'm not sure if I can move them forward by sharing screen now. How should I go about this? Okay, you're in charge of, okay, so next, please. It seems like I'm out of the screen now. I cannot see it. Is it working now? Well, there's a little issue and we'll solve it. I mean, these are things that happen with new technologies, right? So we'll now move to Adriano. I'm sorry, we'll be changing the order and then we'll come back to Santiago. Adriano Targa. He will take us to a different research field. He's a pharmacologist. My fault. Probably I pressed the wrong button. Okay, so the organizers should tell us what to do. Okay, so on my first slide, I'm asking a question, right? How time is used at school. You cannot see me. Sorry, the camera was off. You're right. It's working now. So when we talk about schools, we tend to concern about the kind of contents that need to be taught, how should the whole curriculum be structured, but we forget about when these things have to be taught. What's the optimal time for teaching? And obviously there are psychological consequences, attention, memory, cognitive processes for development of thought in children, etc. If you can show the first slide, please, Ariadna. I don't see it, but next. That's just the first page, this one. So we're concerned about what and how, but not when. Now, here's the outline in general terms. Can you see it? I don't get to see the whole screen. When we talk about this, when I started studying this, is how children understood time and set things in order. I remember some work by Bizet of 1925, a story in a vignette and how they ordered those images in a sequence. So they started understanding the sequence of events. Then I carried out my first experimental work along those lines, and I discovered that there was a conceptual problem of the kind of language that was used. That was a tipping point in the development of children when they were 5, 6, or 7. There came a time in which they could understand what this sequence of events in time meant. Then we worked on some stories with very pragmatic materials. Well, be that as it may, if you're interested, I can provide you more information. These are slides that have been suppressed from this presentation, but they are public as well. So we worked on the understanding of time, and then I wondered, how do we estimate time? Our subjectivity, the fact that we feel it's slower or faster than usual. So we worked on a project where we compared the time estimate in children, the perception, let's say, of children coming from rural areas, small towns in Catalonia, vis-a-vis children from the big city or big cities, where they have a much faster pace and they do a lot of things during the day. Therefore, a group was more in sync with the natural pace of the world, and well, big cities obviously are something always happens much faster. So they showed these images to the kids, and well, curiously enough, there was no difference in how they perceive time from a statistical point of view. There was no significant difference. So what we said is that children from a rural area and children from urban areas perceive time equally, because they're not yet fully immersed in a culture that forces them to understand time that way. But there was one difference. That was between girls and boys. So both in big cities and small towns, they perceived time, the passing of time, differently. So at that time, we thought that this was an issue to be studied. Maybe the human biology can condition given differences at the time where we're living right now and tackling these issues. Okay, so we met on several occasions, and little by little we studied this further, and we said, okay, if there's a biological side, okay, let us now focus on the more cognitive side of things in terms of attentional rhythms or paces of the child. That's something that we worked on. Let's say attention, rhythm, and memories as well, to see throughout the day in this light and darkness cycle, activity and memories, which were the optimal moments in which our nervous system is activated and we are more prone to learning. So if you move to a couple slides further, we did a first project following European guidelines. Next, please. Next. This one. So we said that this should be called an infradian rhythm. So throughout the day, how many times could this rhythm, maybe not infradian, but yes, I think it's infradian because it happens more often during the day. So 33 times during the day following these European guidelines. Apparently at noon there was a drop in our attention, and in the early hours of the morning was not the best time to learn, even though in general the morning was seen more positively as a time for learning. So we realized that this evolution was the same in most Europeans. Temperature and attention increased during the morning. There was a lull, a drop during noon, and then there was yet a smaller peak in the afternoon, and then it dropped in the evening. So this happened in three different occasions during the day. Next, please. So we analyzed what happened during school times. Please, next. And we realized that in children of 5, 6, and 7 years, so these 3 years, there were differences of the circadian rhythm, attention circadian rhythm, even though there was an infradian rhythm as well. It was shorter during the day, for an hour and a half in older kids, attentional rhythm dropped, but then it picked up again during the day, and it increased strongly amongst the adults. So children required attentional rhythms that were much shorter during the day, and that meant that they had to change activities. They had to change activity very quickly, and we observed that these attentional rhythms were stronger amongst the children. A couple slides more, please. So attention has a circadian rhythm, and within that circadian rhythm there are several drops. Then we analyzed memory, so immediate memory and long-term memory. short-term memory and long-term memory. So either you learn something because you need to teach it or tell it right away, or because you'll tell about them later on. So we saw there was an effect in the time that we learned this and the time in which you had to recount this. And again, if we learn something in the afternoon, we have better results over the long run than if we learn something in the morning. So then obviously there's nocturnal or nightly and daily rhythms, because people differ biologically. But be that as it may, afternoon learning is closer to sleep, and sleep helps us establish that knowledge in our memory, as it has been shown with animals as well. Now, this brought us to a different topic, which is, given that it's now in fashion, next please. These are more detailed analyses of these notions. Next. This one. So, how could we manage this time knowing this? Because we had a lot of issues, we had to respond to all of them, and then we discovered lots of things. So we discovered that in an experiment, students went to the school only in the morning in compact school hours, another one only in the afternoon, and the rest just the whole day, both in urban and rural areas. And the results were that attention that increased and then dropped and picked up again in the afternoon offered the same results again. So it was quite low at first, it went up and then down until noon, and same thing happened during the afternoon. So whether they studied only in the morning or the whole day, it didn't matter. It's the amount of hours that they spent there, because longer than 4 hours studying was not advisable, not 5 or 6 hours. And now more recently, this will be my last slide. Next, a couple more, please. Let me finish. We discovered, and these are my colleagues from Valencia that I mentioned earlier, that we started working together. We realized that only studying in the morning, those that have longer hours in this compact schedule, they don't sleep that much, so they lose sleeping time, and obviously they don't study as hard, and they lose also some quality of life. And these are significant data, according to what these colleagues from Valencia have been able to compile in this project, comparing different schooling times. So, by summarizing this, it is extremely important to know how time is experienced and lived by everyone. We tend to think it's an isolated factor, but it brings us to chronobiology, to geology, I would say, because of the light and darkness system, this activity and rest system that we follow. And that is conditioning our behavior. And we could go even beyond that. And I think it plays a role in our culture. And because of the social policies that we follow and the values that we attach to time, we'll speak about this later. There were a couple of things you mentioned about time management, especially you, Nuria. You mentioned things that I'm very keen on because they link up with some of the things I mentioned. I did my best to tell you about a lot of things. I'm not sure if this made sense, but that's it. Thank you.
Santi. Sí, sí, se ha quedat clar.
Well, thank you very much, Santi. That was very clear. You raised a lot of interesting points. It was brief, but anyway, I think it was all very clear. And then we'll, of course, have Q&A. Finally, we're going to hear from Santiago, Adriano Targa, who is a pharmacologist who does research at the Institute of Biomedical Research in Lleida, and he will be talking specifically about some early findings about biological time in COVID-19 patients. This could be, well, even though
a pleasure to be here presenting a little bit of our research. I'm going to talk about the use of time from a different perspective compared to the previous talks. Talking about the biological time in COVID-19 patients, and I'm going to show in a briefly our preliminary findings. So, as we are all aware, around 60 million people were affected by the COVID-19, and we have a lot of outcomes from this. We can see that a lot of patients develop severe complications leading to hospitalization, ICU admission, and increased risk of death. But also, we can see recent studies demonstrated that there are consequences after the hospital discharge, including respiratory, cardiovascular, and neurological disorders. In addition, earlier this year, some authors hypothesized that we also could have sleep and circadian rhythms dysfunction in these patients. And that because of the context in which these patients were at, like the hospitalization, for example, in ICU stay, have like insufficient sunlight exposure or excessive artificial light exposure, increased screen time, for example, increased noise during the night, a different time of food intake, or insufficient physical activity. Also, the symptoms and the medication used to counteract the symptoms of disease could have affected sleep and circadian rhythms after hospital discharge. And finally, the psychological burden associated with this context. So we have a number of things that could have contributed for sleep and circadian rhythms dysfunctions in these patients. Considering this, we aim to investigate the impact of COVID-19 on sleep and circadian rhythms 3 months after the hospital discharge. To do so, we recruited the patients at the Hospital of Santa Maria in Lleida during hospitalization, and we recruited the patients, mostly the patients with acute severe respiratory syndrome. And 3 months after the hospital discharge, these patients returned to the hospital and we performed a clinical evaluation and a sleep evaluation with different questionnaires, including the Petersburg, the Epworth, SADET, and we also performed circadian rhythms evaluation with actigraphy and a modified version of the morning sleepiness scale. And then we have the baseline characteristics of our population. Up to this moment, we have like 86 patients. Most of them are overweight men with a mean age of 58 years. And the most prevalent comorbidity is hypertension, followed by diabetes. We also have some signs of the disease up to this moment, like dyspnea and muscular fatigue. In considering that we recruited the patients with acute severe acute respiratory syndrome, most of them were admitted to the ICU. And here we have the first results related with subjective sleep assessment or in time preference. We can see that a poor sleep quality, according to the Petersburg, especially related with sleep duration. But we don't see anything related with the somnolence and nothing related with other sleep problems according to the stated. And we can see that most of the people have like an increased morning preference, which is expected considering the mean age of our population. And in the objective assessment of sleep and circadian rhythms, we can see that more than half of our population sleeps less than 7 hours per night, which is that is, the people does not sleep the recommended of patients have a decreased sleep efficiency with a decreased number of arousals, and also especially 70% of the population spends more than 40 minutes per night awake after the sleep onset, and that's a lot. In relation to the circadian rhythm variables, we can see especially an increased instability along the days. Just as a matter of example, what we have here is like an ectogram of a person that could represent our sample, the total sample, total population, because the means of this person is really similar to the means of the total population. So what we can see here, for example, is that the light blue represents, I don't know if everybody is aware, but the light blue represents the sleep time. So, and the black represents the activity. So what we can see here is like a lack of stability along the days. The person goes to sleep at different hours each day and wakes up at a different hour, have total sleep time, a different total sleep time along the days. So this is what we are seeing in these patients, a lack of stability along the days. And that means a lack of synchronization with the external cues, with zeitgebers. We don't see much in terms of durability is more or less normal, in the same way with the amplitude. So the main problem with the most of the patients is the instability, representing a lack of synchronization with the external cues. And I here have another example, just a little a worse situation in which you can see also a lack of stability along the days, but you can see increased variability representing a fragmentation of the rhythm of this person, and you can see a decreased amplitude with a lot of activity during the night and moments of inactivity during the day. So in summary, what we have to this moment with these patients is that the COVID-19 patients present poor sleep quality 3 months after hospital discharge, inappropriate sleep efficiency, increased number of arousals, and increased time awake after sleep onset. And similarly, there are alterations in the rest activity rhythms, especially related to a decreased stability along the days, which represents a lack of synchronization with the external cues, with zeitgebers. So the next steps in this investigation is to evaluate the possible associations between circadian rhythms and sleep alterations and the respiratory and immune function, which is based on literature. There are relations in which, if you have disrupted circadian rhythms, you will have more susceptibility for infections, for example. So this is very important in this context if we see associations. The other step is evaluate whether there are risk factors for the observed alteration in sleep and circadian rhythms. And if we see these, the risk factors, if we find risk factors, we can apply different measures to prevent these, the sleep and circadian rhythm alterations of patients in this or future pandemics or future pandemics. And these measures could be very simple depending on the situation, like appropriate light exposure, both at home or at the hospital, avoidance of excessive noise, maintenance of a regular routine, among other things. In the general, in summary, this means an appropriate use of time, appropriate use of light, appropriate use timing of food, appropriate physical activity, whatever is possible. So that means an appropriate use of time. This is it. I want to thank especially the patients that contributed to this investigation, the funding of it, obviously, and the good team that we have, the nurses, the doctors, and the sleep technicians that who make possible this investigation. Thank you very much.
why these patients are having these sleep dysfunctions or disorders. That's really important, of course. Okay, so let's start the Q&A with a question received from Jessica Klein from Lichta. And it's a question about what Sara mentioned. More dust, less cooking. So the question is, what other implications could this have for society? The fact that there's more dust and less cooking in households. This is leading to the hiring of other people, sometimes under illegal contracts, to carry out this work traditionally done by women. What other changes could occur in society as a result of this more dust, less cooking pattern? Thank you very much. Maybe I should qualify my statement. I mean, we are seeing changes. The statistics tell us that these changes are happening, and our interviews can enable us to gauge the values and narrative behind it. But as I said earlier, there's also a factor that has to do with age and level of education, which also implies sociocultural standing. So we're talking especially about young couples who are childless. As soon as the child arrives, a whole lot of other domestic work allocation has to be done. In the case of double income, no kids, this more dust, less cooking, there are certain tasks that disappear. For instance, in terms of caring for clothes, people choose clothes that don't require ironing so that they don't have to spend time on tasks that they don't assign a high value to. In the case of medium to high income couples, what they usually do is hire somebody else to do this work. That's a fairly common strategy, aside from devoting less time to care of clothes. Also, for double income, no kids couples, what they value is food, but they don't value the time spent on preparing food. It'll be interesting to find out whether COVID-19 has brought about a change in those terms. But these childless young couples usually improvise. For instance, for lunch, they often don't go home, so they find other ways of eating. And then in the evening, they either eat out or they buy pre-cooked meals. That's if they can afford to. If they can't afford to, then they have other strategies. But they overall do devote less time to cooking. So what implications could this have? Well, there are cultural factors here, of course. The value assigned to cleanliness, to household cleanliness, is cultural. I mean, there are certain standards here which are different from standards in other countries. They're high compared to most, and the fact is that the standards are being lowered. As to food, food matters a lot, but not the time spent on it. There is more value assigned to spending a lot of time buying local, high-quality produce, not as much to cooking time. If this remains, then it might lead to a loss in daily well-being. It may mean living in homes that are less clean and spending more time in the kitchen. So this idea of daily well-being is something that's beyond material well-being as such. Now, there is a whole shift in values when children come upon the scene. both in terms of time use and in terms of time spent on cooking. I mean, so yes, women and men both spend more time with children, but women spend much more, and the more rigid, more daily and tougher housework jobs or tasks are taken on by women. The men do more of the shopping and the weekend care of children. So actual time is increased by both, but there's more of a gender gap because women allocate more time. But there is still a segregation of gender segregation of tasks and housework too. Thank you very much. We have two very specific questions for specific people, then we have broader questions as well. Would anybody else like to comment on this particular question? Well, there's one thing I would like to share, which we've never used. We carried out a little survey on future life projects of individuals. Well, that's something that you ask children in schools. And we did this in a school that was mostly a girls' school. Okay, this was a school that segregates girls and boys a lot. And we interviewed girls in their last year of high school, getting ready to go to university, and we asked them what their life goals were. And all these girls, so this is a social and cultural factor quite clearly, all of these girls had a goal to get married. So they were going to go to college, but then they would get married and devote their time to the household. Some, very few of them, said they would go to college and then they would work and then they would get married and have children. Once they had children, they would quit working, and then once the children were grown up, they would go back to work. So in this school, they had already taken on board a certain framing. I mean, you're talking about new generations, but of course, in this case, we're talking about a school that clearly segregates boys and girls. So it's possible that the culture transmitted within the school is like that. So from the perspective of life goals, I had to challenge that. Is this really your life goal? To just, be a housewife and a nice, pleasant partner to your husband. The way women were advised to grow up when I was growing up. Women were culturally instructed to be there as a pleasant helpmate for their husbands. So I think in schools, there are certain things that need to be addressed or tackled differently. Maybe not explicitly, but we really need to do something about the perceptions and patterns that are being acquired by growing boys and girls. I mean, I'm not saying that, more dust, less cooking should be the case or not, but I do think we have to question what's going on. I mean, the fact is that there are things that you see even in school children, and if schools can't do something about it, well, maybe we can have an influence on life goals. Having life goals also helps regulate some things such as drug use even. But of course, I mean, I'd better shut up because otherwise you sociologists will say that a psychologist who is into social psychology, of course, is trying to tell you what to do. And you'll especially resent it from me since I'm also, I was also a teacher at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Okay, well, we have some specific questions and some broader questions. One specific question for Joan. This is about research. What methods do demographers use to study time? I guess you use questionnaires, but since we're making technical progress, are you using other ways of assessing people's time use in your studies? We work with time use diaries, especially, which has been found to be the most reliable way to obtain this kind of data. That said, time use diaries are costly. They're also burdensome for the study subjects. And so that's why our most recent data are for 2009, 2010. New ways of collecting data, applications, are coming up. I don't know these methods in depth. But there's some information that only time use diaries report to us. They tell us what you're doing, but where you are, who you're with. I really think those are the best kind of data source. But we do have to bring on board new ways of collecting this data. I believe that is being done using mobile apps or internet apps and so on. Okay, there's a question for all of our speakers now. Several of you, I think all of you, in fact, have referred to changes in certain patterns over time. The way we play, the way we cook. Significant changes. So if we're talking about time use policies, this is a question from the organizers, have these changes come about as a result of specific policies, or do we have little control over the way we manage time? Is it just a matter of broader changes in society? I mean, now we're all working from home because of COVID, working on Zoom, working 12 hours a day. This is a change that has occurred. Well, but what, to what extent are we able to manage our time with policies? Or are we just making fine adjustments, a little fine tuning, like 15 more minutes at school or a little more time in the playground? Or do we have the ability to manage time by way of policies? If anybody would like to say anything about it. Would you like me to tell you a story since you're talking about policies? Once I put a project about time use to the ministry. It's about experiencing time and valuing time. And what the ministry replied was, this is a very interesting topic, but it's not a priority for the government. And that was it. That was from the ministry in Madrid. And that was their reply twice over. So is it about time use policies, or is it the culture that's developing and evolving, that's bringing about the changes, and then politicians are lagging behind? Okay, from my experience, from my own discipline, I can tell you that it's hard to discern whether a given change is a result of a given policy or just changing patterns without further ado. But what I can say is that certain policies have a clear impact on time use patterns. By way of example, individual non-transferable parental leave. In other words, the fact that parental leave is an individual right of both a man and a woman, not one that has to be compensated between one and the other, which lasts the same amount of time for both and cannot overlap in time. This clearly has a positive impact. Men increase the time they devote to housework and to care for others, and the effect is enduring. It's also been found that when a child arrives in a family, the patterns that are set in the early months will prevail over time. So the fact that women and men have equal non-transferable parental leave at birth means that the man will spend time at home and will get used to caring for the child. The child will get used to the idea that there is more than one regular caregiver, and the fact or caring pattern. The countries that have this sort of policy have found that their statistics on time use have changed very significantly as from the time these changes were introduced. Thank you very much. Nuria, did you have something to say on this topic regarding leisure? Yes, I definitely do. It's very hard, I agree, to see causal relationships with certain changes. But some small changes can be found. There is resistance to change, but when certain changes are proposed as on a positive basis, they eventually make their way through. I've been working on women and physical activities, physical exercise, for many years. 50 years ago, women didn't exercise, or as Santiago said, if they did, they were criticized for not doing household work instead of exercise. But now, women who were socialized according to this pattern are devoted to the gym, and they really want to adhere to gym attendance, because when they can't go to the gym, they experience a significant impact in terms of quality of life. Small things all add up and make a difference. Major things, for bigger things, there's more resistance to change. So some changes can be implemented gradually over time. Okay, we said we would have a debate at the end, so this is what I'm going to say for now. Well, thanks for not taking up too much time, because the organizers are telling me I have time for one more question for each of you. We have 3 minutes left, so you have very, very little time to answer this question. What are the main key lines of research over time use that will be developed over the next few years? You can't really answer this question in half a minute, but that's what I'm asking you to do. In your opinion, what is your priority research about this for you personally? And secondly, what should the priority be for this country? Very briefly. Okay, you have 2.5 minutes, so half a minute each for these tiny questions. Who's first? Joan. Is it me? Okay. From the perspective of research, we'll continue to carry out the kind of study I presented today, but with perhaps different questions. If we had done this research a year before COVID, the answers would have been different, because the priority issues were different ones. So now we're trying to look at how time use patterns are changing because of the pandemic. Are there changes in household work, changes in leisure? Have some of the changes brought about by COVID-19 come here to stay? But I apologize for being such a demographer, but the fact is that, we really need more data. So this is a call for more surveys to be carried out. Okay, thank you very much. Next, Sara. Let's see if I can use this half a minute properly. I don't know whether I explained what I was trying to say properly. There is no linear relationship between policies and changes. That should be clear. I just wanted to make the point that policies do make a difference, and that policies need to be very clear in intention and not ambivalent. As to what we need in terms of research, we need data, like Joan said. We're all waiting for the third major survey on time use for Spain and Catalonia to come out. For those of us who do research, it's essential to have these data and to have the data regularly, because one of our areas of research is studying how this changes over time. Obviously, time uses are a reflection of the times, and everything is increasingly complex. We have more and more lifetime situations that we have to contend with, and whatever. I think research has to focus especially on looking at continuity, and of course, to carry out research, we need continuity of data.
On estan les resistències, com molt bé
To know exactly what the changes are, where people are more reluctant, as Nuria was saying, and to design policies in order to transform reality on equal footing. And I would agree with Joan as well, just 5 more seconds, that these changes, these evolution we've seen in the past 20 years of research, we need to see what the pandemic has meant, how it has impacted it. It's very recent. We don't have the analytical hindsight to understand this. We need to see whether it's something fleeting or structural, because crises usually intensify the workload that women have and the invisible and unpaid jobs. Thank you, Nuria. It's your turn. Thank you. Well, from the psychosocial point of view, which comes to add to the debate, I think that we're all working from different fields, but they feed onto one another. So from this psychosocial point of view, the COVID crisis tells us that we need to continue along these lines. We need to focus more on people themselves, on individuals. We believe that when we talk about time use, we need to reinforce people's abilities to make an optimal use of their time. We work on autonomy, on self-sufficiency, and also the ability to self-regulate time. And by that I mean that we need to, organize our working hours. We need to juggle that with all kinds of tasks that we need to undertake, but also to distribute time so that we can include other non-work related things, such as leisure. And as part of leisure, we also need to have the ability to know what kind of leisure activity pays off more for me, or that it fits well with my day-to-day, if it helps me get out of home. So we believe that in the future we need to continue along those lines, at least from the psychological perspective. Thank you. Santi, on to you. Even though, given that I'm a moderator, I'll use my privilege and I'll ask you another question. You said that attention comes and goes, right? It goes up and down. And there's no solution to that, because you cannot spend more than 4 hours fully concentrated on something. So on top of research and future research, what do you think we should do at schools? What could a solution be for a school curriculum so that children can make the most of the time they spend there? I'm sorry because I'm asking an additional question, but I'd love to see how you understand this, and then what kind of additional research should be done. Okay, I'll answer that question right away. At least that's my view. I believe that this infradian rhythm of attention changes as children grow. So with small children, it's 20-25 minutes, that round of top level of attention, need to rest, and going up 20-25 minutes. So children at school throughout the day, even making short breaks, every 20-30 minutes, so that they can get rested. These should happen by 4 hours. It should be in the morning, the afternoon, and as children grow, this can be expanded. This attention cycle is about 1.5 hours, 1.5 hours, which is exactly the same sleep pattern. REM sleep tends to follow a 1.5 hour cycles. So that's what I would try to replicate. So having an intensive school hours, 6 hours straight, is very negative, and data are showing that children waste a lot of time and they don't use it or compensate it in other activities. It's a burning topic in France, for instance, how school time should be organized. But be that as it may, I remember a dean of psychology that wanted to teach 3-hour classes, and after a whole year that he had to take that back because it had been a mistake. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question about school hours. I know that this is quite controversial because there are a lot of social activities and trying to live together. If we don't change the working hours, it's very difficult for school hours to follow through. So it's something that goes well beyond the facilities of a school. Now, what would I like to see? Well, I think that chronobiology must be integrated with chronopsychology. We need to continue along those lines so that we can come up with better individual life projects that allow us to better manage our time. That would be my ideal. And that would involve changing lots of field of research. Time has a grip on us, it dominates us, it conditions us. We live based on the perception we have of time, and we could control it by managing it. So it's a very broad notion, very complex as well, but it would bring together what Joan and Sara and Adriano were telling us in terms of pathologies, and that's a completely different issue. But throughout our life, everything follows cycles. Nature does as well. Everything comes and goes, and we follow cycles that keep repeating, and neurosciences are no exception. Great, thank you. So, Adriano.
Already mentioned, the idea is to increase the awareness of all the people and how to use the time in an appropriate way, because to improve the awareness and how the use of time in an appropriate way could improve your health or prevent the diseases, especially in different contexts. And this apply to the people and to the society and maybe to the politics. This is the idea when we are doing investigation. And obviously in different contexts, like now what we have, the COVID-19, the confinement, and I really think that the interesting part of a talk like this, for what we have, is that we can apply us from the biological field. We can apply some of the things that were mentioned here to our investigations and see if there are biological outcomes from the things that are already here in terms of culture. For example, when we think about confinement and we see the sleep quality and the circadian rhythms of people during the confinement, surely the biological effects of this are different among men and women due to the tests that these people have. So this is the interesting point of this conversation. So I think the idea was to improve the awareness of people and consequently improve the health and quality of life.
So, thanks a lot. Moltes gràcies. Doncs,
Okay, thank you. So we had 1.5 hours allocated. That's the longest we can be concentrated. Now we know. So we'll finish here with a couple more comments. First, we failed to mention physics, epidemiology, and other kinds of fields of study, but it's impossible to be all-encompassing. This is a very broad research area. And I'd like to mention three things that have been brought up in most presentations. First, COVID-19 and how it has changed our way of living and experiencing time. This is something that needs to be considered in future research. This continuity in data and research, how important this is if we want to keep offering research of the highest quality. And thirdly, how complex this issue is, because we can carry out very research that is limited in scope, but these kind of topics cannot be fully addressed with a very targeted kind of research. You need a very broad and complex lens to analyze it. And I think that's it. I'd like to thank all the speakers for these interesting presentations and the organizers that have offered a whole week to speak about how we use our time. Thank you.
Gràcies.
Gràcies.
Adéu.
Gràcies
Bon dia.
a tots.
Adéu. Moltes gràcies.
Vinga, adéu-siau.
Adéu.